at this point, we should be ready to call this method and then save our user, and we have validation on the input, and you can see that we're checking to make sure that we're never gonna get duplicate value. Actually, let me change those. Let's do new username. I don't want this to be confusing or ambiguous. I'm gonna change those. Say new email, because this is checking the existing. So we are just treating those as new information, and then down there we can have regular user by username, user by email, just so I don't confuse you with this object and this object up here. Okay, so we should be able to use this now, and then debug it, step through it to make sure it's working fine. Let's go back to the user resource. So let's go into the resource folder, and let's go to the resource, and here let's just remove this and do register. Okay, so this is gonna be the register, and you know that if we go back here, it returns a user, so we have to make it return a user as well. So instead of a string, we're gonna return a user, and we're gonna call it register. It's not gonna take, well, it's actually gonna take a user. So let's do user, and that's gonna be the user. And here we have to add an annotation, which is request body, and this est. Okay, so, and I think it's gonna throw user not found, so we can leave this here. So it's gonna go to either roots and register or /user and register, and it's gonna return a user. So now what we have to do, we have to call the service. So if we go back once, here we have to call it from here. We're not gonna call it directly from the implementation here. We're gonna call it from the service, because this is our service. The service will then call the implementation. So we need to bring this service into the resource. Okay, so let's create a private, and it's gonna be user service, and I'm gonna create a constructor with just the user service. Okay, so here I just have to pass in the AutoWire annotation. So at AutoWire. Okay, so we're wiring in the actual user service. So in the registration, all we have to do is just call the user service dot register, and we're gonna pass in the information that we got from the user. So first name, last name, username, and then email. So user dot get first name, and we need user dot get last name, and user dot get email. Well, nope, get username, and email user dot get email. Okay, so here we need to add the exception to the signature of the method, and this is going to return a user. So user, and I'm just going to call it user. Okay, so at this point we should have, and it's gonna be post mapping, because we're saving information in the database. Okay, so we're not just getting information with a get request, we're actually sending a post request because we're trying to save. So I got an error here, and that's because I already have user defined here in the same method or in the same scope. So I'm just gonna call this one login user, since that's the user currently trying to log in. And then here, all I have to do now is to just return a new response to the user. So I can do return new response entity, response entity, and this is gonna return the user, so login user, and it's gonna return an HTTP status of okay. Okay, so at this point I think we should also make this return an HTTP response of user. I'm going to remove this, pass it in here. Okay, so I think we have everything we need. So what's gonna happen when the user tries to call this endpoint, they're gonna send a request body, which is gonna be a user. Now I have the whole user object here, right? with all of this information, but we're actually not using all of this information. Okay, so instead of creating a separate user to accept it as a request body, I just use the same existing user, but we're only using the first name, last name, username, and email. Okay, because those are the ones that we're expecting. Well, actually, this is not login user. It's not login user. It's a new user. Okay, so that's the new user here. All right, so if we call this endpoint, then we should be able to put in a new user in the application. So we're gonna go ahead and try this in the next lecture.